Informed Choice Radio, episode 344 with Dr Moira Somers, how to give financial advice that people will follow.
Live from Sundial House Studios, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Now, here's your host, Martin Bamford.
What good is excellent advice if you don't follow it? As a financial planner, I know that when my advice goes unimplemented, the well-being of my clients is compromised, opportunities are lost, and the professional relationship grows strained. My guest on the podcast today has written an excellent new book, taking aim at the problem of financial non-adherence. Dr Moira Somers is a leading practitioner in the field of financial psychology and financial change. A neuropsychologist, professor and executive coach, she blends the science and art of advice giving with practical wisdom and wit. Through her popular keynote addresses and follow-up seminars, she works with financial professionals and organisations around the globe, equipping them to give easy-to-implement advice that captures clients' hearts and minds. Moira's new book, Advice That Sticks, examines the 5 main factors that determine whether a client will follow through with financial advice. Individual client psychology plays a role in non-adherence too. So too do socio-cultural and environmental factors, general advice characteristics, and specific challenges pertaining to the emotionally loaded domain of money. Perhaps most surprising, however, is the extent to which advice givers themselves can foil implementation. A great deal of non-adherence is due to preventable mistakes made by financial professionals and by their teams. I think this episode is equally as important for financial practitioners as it is for investors who take advice from others. And we've tried to balance the conversation to provide value to both advice givers and advice takers. You can find the show notes for this episode along with some useful links at icradio.co.uk/344. Here's my conversation with Dr Moira Somers in episode 344 of Informed Choice Radio. Well, welcome back to Informed Choice Radio. I'm delighted today to welcome all the way from Winnipeg in Canada, Dr. Moira Somers. We're talking about your new book, Moira, which is called Advice That Sticks. But before we get into that, perhaps you could start by introducing yourself, telling us a bit about you and about what it is you do.
I'm a neuropsychologist and a professor and an executive coach. And the thing that I really like to do is to help figure out some of the tricks of the brain that make behavior change possible, or at the other end of the spectrum, that actually foil some of our best intentions for our lives.
And that's it's an interesting job title, neuropsychologist. So how would you describe that to the layperson? What does it mean?
Like many psychologists, I work in the area of behavior change and well-being. As a neuropsychologist, I'm particularly interested in brain functioning, both regular, normal brain functioning, as well as brain damage or neurological disease. And in recent years, I've become very interested in a new field of economics called neuroeconomics and behavioral economics, which really brings together the world of money and the world of brain functioning in some very lovely and interesting ways.
Oh, fantastic. And as I said in the introduction, we're here today to talk about your new book. It's called Advice That Sticks, How to Give Financial Advice That People Will Follow. So tell us a bit about that. I think the title maybe tells us a lot, but what's the book all about? What was the motivation for writing it?
You know, as somebody who's worked in the healthcare system for many years and trained a lot of medical doctors, I became aware early on that part of the reason that people don't do what they're advised to do is sometimes based in the giver of the advice, not so much in the person who's receiving it. In other words, sometimes advice is given in really unskilled ways. And that we need to get better as people who are advising others and figure out what can we do that actually gives them a fighting chance to do the right thing for their health, for their relationships, or in this case, for their money. There's also factors relating to things like the social environment in which people function. In other words, none of us function in a vacuum. So we may have the best intention to eat better, but if we happen to be living in a household with people who really, really despise vegetables, it can be hard for us to maintain that change over time. And so I've just become fascinated with how do we bring together the best of science, the best of neuroscience, to help people make and sustain positive changes for their lives.
If you were somebody who was on the receiving end of advice being given in a really unskilled way, would you necessarily recognize that at the time? Would that be easy to spot?
I think we absolutely feel it when it's happening, and it can show up in a number of ways. Sometimes it can show up through feelings of profound discouragement. You know, when advice is given well, it's like getting a shot of iron, or a real vitamin boost, because advice that's given well lands in such a way that people feel they actually have a fighting chance of doing this thing. Whereas advice that's unskillfully given makes people feel like they don't know where to start, or it's so complicated that there's no way in heck that they'll be able to sustain it over time. So discouragement is often one of the key signs that it's being given unskillfully. Another tip-off is just frank confusion, not being able to understand what it is that's being said. And that's a particular problem in the financial domain, where people just speak in baffle gab that's how it lands on most of the public. As financial advisors go through their training, they learn literally thousands of new terms. And once you've learned something, it's kind of hard for you to remember that there was a time when you didn't know what that meant. And so that really sophisticated and specialized vocabulary trips over into how they deal with people who may not understand basic concepts, especially if they're younger people. They may not even know what the word asset means, for example. They may not understand images that we use all the time. Things like, is it in the red or is it in the black? As technologies change and as people's experience of this language changes over time, you really have to watch the words you use when dealing with people. So just getting back to your question, things like confusion, discouragement are often tip-offs that you're not sitting in the presence of somebody who's giving you the kind of advice that you can do.
And obviously, if we seek professional advice, we want it to stick. We want to actually go and implement that advice, assuming it's good advice, which I'd hope any financial advisor would be giving. I know within the book you've got 5 different factors that determine whether an individual will follow a set of advice. Could you briefly tell us about those? I won't ask you to sort of spoil the ending of the book, but briefly, what are those 5 factors?
I've given the acronym FACT to describe what the research literature says will really influence the likelihood of advice being followed through with. And so the first one is simply finance. People's history with money, their level of comfort in dealing with it. And as you can probably imagine, that varies so dramatically from person to person. What did they learn about money in their family of origin? What kinds of financial mistakes do they feel that they've made? What is their earning capacity? What have they come to believe about where they ought to be functioning in the financial sense? So that's the first. It's that, unpacking that whole area of people's relationship and beliefs with money. The second area that influence is just simply some of the advice characteristics itself. Are we asking people to do something that's really quite, one little individual step, like just sign this paper that will allow you to make monthly contributions. And once that's signed and once you've worked that into your life, there really isn't much else for you to do, and it just kind of chugs out seamlessly. Or instead, are we being asked to do something that's perhaps equally important in any given situation, but much more difficult, like tracking finances and writing down everything that we spend money on, and then making widespread lifestyle choices and changes in light of that data. So tracking expenses is actually one of those homework assignments that has a very poor rate of compliance. So, is your advice short-term and very easy to implement, or is it cumbersome? Is it visual? Is it obviously different from what your friends and your peers might be doing? Does it require a great deal of willpower to implement, or is it pretty seamless? Then there are the things that reside in the individual itself. We know that there are individual differences in the clients that we serve, in the people that we work with. Some of them may have a great deal of capacity to, let's say, defer gratification. They may be somebody who understands high-level concepts. They may have very high IQ, or they may struggle more to understand some of the basic concepts. They may be they may be a person who's very impulsive, or they may be somebody who's very self-disciplined. When we work with people, we tend to kind of overestimate the extent to which those individual differences actually influence the likelihood of our advice being taken up. Mostly, the biggest personal characteristic that influences whether somebody will follow through on advice being the advice that they're given is simply, do they believe it? And do they believe that it's within their power to make the change that they need to make? In the scientific literature, that gets called self-efficacy. But what we're really talking about is the belief that you have what it takes to do this thing, to make this difference in your life. That's the most powerful individual difference. Then there are things, as I said, that the therapist does, or the team or the advisor does, whether they're giving that advice skillfully or not, whether they've got some of the follow-up mechanisms in place, or do they just kind of come to a meeting, tell you what you do, and then you don't hear from them for the next 18 months. And the final of the 5 domains in the FACTS paradigm has to do with the social environment in which you function. So, for example, you may be very keen to get going on a very aggressive debt pay down or a very ambitious savings program, but if your spouse isn't on board, or if you have adult children who are constantly asking you to bail them out, then that may very much affect what happens to your own intentions. There's that the kind of social environment at the family level, and then there's the broader social environment. Are we in a time of recession or expansion? Are you part of a culture that values savings, or are you part of the instant gratification culture? These have profound effects on how much people are able to do with the financial advice that they get.
Do you think any of those in particular have a bigger impact than others?
I think that there's probably the untapped potential right now comes from our understanding of the social environment, the broader environment in which people function, and from the science that says there are actually some things that we can do to set up better defaults so that people do the right thing more seamlessly with their money. So it's things like the automatic enrolling into a pension plan, and where you have to opt out rather than the other way, which is how it functions in many other countries, that you have to opt into a pension plan. So setting up those environmental and social things so that they work for people's advantage without taking away any choice. It just changes the choice architecture. We know that we can do much better at that level than we have been doing in the past.
And then selfishly, as an advisor, I need to ask this: are there things that I could be doing when I'm giving hopefully good advice to people, which could be really foiling its implementation, sort of putting people off taking my advice?
Well, just the fact that you're willing to ask that question is such a good sign, Martin. I would say that what comes out in my research time and again is very similar to what comes out in the research from the medical field, which is that professionals talk far too much. They take up way too much of the airtime, particularly during the first meeting or two. That is a time where you need to get control of your own nervousness or your own need to impress, and instead really focus on getting to know this person that you're trying to serve. The outcome data show that satisfaction with an advisor is directly related to how much airtime the client gets. And so if you're taking up that airtime yourself, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
No, absolutely. Is there a balance to be found here between the quality of the advice that's being given and the quality of the delivery of the advice? Is one more important than the other, potentially?
There's some very, very complicated financial situations that advisors have to wade into. And by nature of their training, the best advisors are, by virtue, of their credentialing, I think the best advisors are highly trained and they know a great deal. And sometimes clients would be best served by just explaining the situation fully and honestly, not withholding any information, which is sometimes a problem for advisors, and then letting the advisors take the data and go away and make some recommendations and come back. But what the advisors need to make sure that they're doing then with their very best recommendations is making it utterly simple to understand. So in other words, this can be a very, very complex situation. Again, if we go back to the medical analogy, you may very well appreciate the fact that if somebody's doing a sophisticated cardiac operation or a brain surgery, that the level of background skill that they have has to be absolutely stellar. But when they come in and they tell you about the problem that you have and the solution that they're proposing, you don't want them to tell you the solutions at the cellular level. You want them to give you the overview in a level that you can understand. And so advisors need to get better at coming to a bottom line, at giving recommendations in very basic terms, and then be prepared to go as deep as the client needs to go. But the evidence shows that advisors grossly overestimate how much clients are able to understand in given meetings, particularly, Martin, when those clients are stressed. Much of the time, much of what fuels your business as an advisor, most of your new clients, for example, will be coming to you during times of major life transitions: divorce, widowhood, pending retirement, pending marriage. And whether those events are regrettable or just welcomed, whether they're foreseeable or whether they just kind of crash landed into somebody's life, what is for sure about those events is that they're going to make a huge difference in the person's identity, and it's going to change from business as usual to something altogether different. And that's the state that people are in when they reach out for financial advice. And so as a result, some of their cognitive bandwidth, some of the normal intelligence or even listening capacity that they might have, may be a little bit in shorter supply than is customary for them. And so advisors would do well to keep that in mind. And so too would clients do well to keep that in mind. If they're talking to an advisor because they've just learned that their marriage is ending, they may be able to say, I'm not normally this emotional, or I'm not, this is not the state that I would have wished we could have met in. But I just want to let you know that I don't think my thinking is as sharp as it usually is. So I need you to bear that in mind as we go through our meeting today. So that, in other words, it kind of behooves both the client and the advisor to signal what level of comprehension and what level of engagement is possible for them in any given meeting.
What's the correct response from the advisor when they're dealing with somebody who's going through an emotionally difficult period of life? It's obviously to keep things simple. Would it be to start simple and start with very small steps and build that up over time, just to test the water a little bit?
I think the very best thing to do, Martin, is to go to the client and say, what is heaviest on your heart and mind right now? And what would make the biggest difference if we could accomplish that today, or if we could set things in motion today? What else is on your mind that we may be able to postpone for now, so that it's not that we're going to forget about it. Indeed, I'm going to, put it in my schedule to follow up on this in the next month or two. But we don't have to take on everything at once. I just want to make sure we're taking on the most important thing, the thing that has a pressing deadline, or the thing that is weighing most heavily on you, or the thing that you are most eager to get to. And so you look to the client for the direction in a lot of this, because if the client has the motivation, the intrinsic motivation to deal with this thing, and if you have helped them to see that it can be dealt with, then usually you just have to stand back and watch it happen. It's when you're giving them, telling them to do things that they really aren't juiced up for, that they really aren't convinced is the most important thing, that's when it starts feeling like you're encountering resistance, or the person is balking. That's when they don't return your phone calls or the paperwork. So it's really important to tap into what the client's perception is of the most important thing, and to have conversation about that, and to determine by the end of your meeting with them, are we still on board that that's where you want to start? There's this one other thing that I may suggest we should get to. How would you feel about me doing some work on your behalf in that regard? But really help the client put his or her mind at ease about what's driving them to come to you.
Moira, it's such an important subject. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today to talk about it. Before I let you go, where can we connect with you? How can we connect with you online? And how can we get hold of a copy of your book?
My website is moneymindandmeaning.com. And my book, Advice That Sticks, is available through online purchase through Amazon.
Fantastic. And we'll put links in our show notes for this episode so our listeners can find that nice and easily. They can find your website and find your book. Moira, thank you so much for your time.
It was lovely. Thank you.
A big thank you to Moira for joining us on this episode of Informed Choice Radio. What good is good advice if it's not implemented? I think that's a really important thing to consider. And Moira's new book, Advice That Sticks, is well worth a read, both for advisors and also for those who take their advice. You can find the show notes for this episode, along with useful links and links to her book, at icradio.co.uk/344. And let me know what you think about what we discussed in this episode of the podcast. You can drop me a line at martin@icfp.co.uk, get in touch on Twitter at Martin Bamford, or leave me a voicemail via our website, that's icradio.co.uk/voicemail. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.